this is what we're going to do. We're going to make a number of observations, and then we'll see how many of them we can actually solve and understand. And so the first thing is ki tavo la'aretz. So even though in Vayikra, most things, when we started at least, we thought everything was dealing with the Mishkan. We thought laws of the Mishkan. The first 9 chapters or so took us in that direction. But at some point, we also found laws which were interpersonal and laws which apply all over. But over here, it's going to go back to Ki tavo la'aretz. And again, that's one of the quote-unquote surprises in terms of the book, that we started off that the holy place that we knew as being the holy place was the Mishkan, and then at some point, it was very subtle when it happened, but at some point we came to the realization that the holy place was actually the land of Israel, and therefore there was a micro and there was a macro, and the micro is the Mishkan and the macro is Eretz Yisrael. So over here, Ki tavo la'aretz asher ani noten lachem v'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat la'Hashem. So therefore, the first reference that we should be thinking about is the idea of Shabbat. Yes, we have Ki tavo la'aretz, so if you want, you can call that the first thing, but then you have this idea of Shabbat, and the application of Shabbat in this particular case is actually quite interesting, because we're used to a Shabbat in terms of exclusively time. And again, think about it for a moment. That from the moment of creation, counting every 7th day is going to be Shabbat, and therefore that doesn't make a difference where you are. It doesn't make a difference of all kinds of other things. It doesn't make a difference of what month you're in. It doesn't make a difference what year you're in. It is a constant, and that is what we would call the Shabbat. The 7th day, day of rest. God rested, took us out of Egypt. We rest. But over here you have this idea about the land, which almost like takes upon a personality, V'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat la'Hashem. That the land, in the land of Israel, not land all over, there's going to be the Sabbath. So again, this reference that we need to pay attention to is this concept of Shabbat. Now, part of what we're going to get to, there are times that I've called this intertextuality in terms of there are certain words in one place and then they can found in a different place, and then they will go back and forth and have this kind of cross-pollination and teaches. Over here, it's more than just words. It's not just that there's a word in a particular place, there's a concept, which means till this moment, we had no idea that there is such a thing as a Shabbat. By the way, Shemitah was mentioned before. But over here, this idea of Shabbat ha'aretz, Shabbat la'Hashem, is quite interesting. And then it doubles down on it as we continue. Sheishanim tizras sadecha, v'sheishanim tizmor karmecha, v'safta et tvuata, uv'shana hashvi'it, Shabbat Shabbaton, yeh la'aretz, Shabbat la'Hashem. Lo tizra v'karmecha lo tizmor. So this idea of Shabbat is used another 2 or 3 times over here. Shabbat Shabbaton, which is something I want to think about. Shabbat la'Hashem. Next pasuk again. Vaytash Shabbat ha'aretz lachem la'ochla l'chal avdecha la'matecha u'lizkircha l'toshvecha hagarim imach. Which actually now says is that part of what the resting is, it's really a resting from ownership. It's a resting from seeing this as your own private property, because the food which is there can be used by others. It could be used by people that work for you. It could be people that live there, strangers amongst you. It continues, animals as well, which means we're going back to a very natural situation, but it's one which transcends, I'm sorry for some of you who may be capitalists, but it transcends capitalism, and it goes back to a type of a socialist concept whereby everybody can have ownership. Not only everybody, everything, the animals as well, have the rights. I mean, part of the laws of Shemitah will be that as long as it's being eaten in the field by animals, meaning you can't hoard. If you just went and started loading up your house with it, you're only allowed to eat it until the time that the animals in the field still have access to it, which means that over here, everything is moving back to this other type of existence, and it's whereby everyone and everything has access. V'safarta l'cha sheva shabbatot shanim, sheva shanim, sheva pamim, v'yu l'cha yemei sheva shabbatot shanim, teisha v'arbim shana. Now, right there, as we finish Pasuk Chet, we now have gotten to a new place and a new frame of reference, and new questions are going to emerge. Last week, when we were minding our own business in the middle of Parshat Emor, we had a list of the various holidays. And, I've said this many times, that every time you have a list of holidays, you need to see what the list is, where it begins, where it ends, what's included, what's not included. So therefore, in Parshat Pinchas, just for example, you have the Korbanot, but you begin with every day, you go to Rosh Chodesh. Over here in the Parsha, in Vayikra, in Parshat Emor, we have our list of holidays, but our list of holidays doesn't include every day, and it doesn't include Rosh Chodesh. It does include Shabbat, which seems to be that the main issue there is actually one of work or cessation from work, malacha or cessation from malacha, especially with an emphasis on the agricultural background to it. So therefore, Rosh Chodesh is a time that you have a Korban Musaf, so therefore it is going to be mentioned in Parsha Pinchas, which deals with Korbanot, but it's not going to be listed over here because there's no Isur Malacha, there's no prohibition of work when it comes to Rosh Chodesh. So as I said, just trying to make sense of the lists. But then, again, minding our own business, right there in the middle, we have this deep dive into something that we knew nothing about till this moment, and that was the Omer. And the Omer is going to be bracketed or surrounded by two other days which do have cessation of work. And that's going to be Pesach or Chag HaMatzot on the one hand and Chag Shavuot on the other hand. So therefore it's surrounded by those two. And we also told we have to count 7 days, 7 weeks, 49 days altogether, right? You count days, you count weeks. And we probably had all kinds of theories when we got up to that point about what it meant, what the message is. One of the things that we were most likely captivated with is the argument, what exactly Mimachrat HaShabbat means, what does Shabbat mean in that particular context. And by the way, Shabbat most likely there means a cessation of work. It doesn't mean Saturday, because there are various other days being called Shabbaton, including Yom Kippur. And this is cessation of work on the first of the month, which is Rosh Hashanah, and there's a cessation of work on the 15th of the month, which is Sukkot, and there's a cessation of work on the 10th of the month. And you cannot have all three of those coming out on Saturday. That doesn't work. 1, 10, and 15 can't all be Saturday. So what we see then, as I said, just looking there, we would have had all kinds of theories. But then something happens, and that is that we have over here a very similar format. And the format now, instead of counting days and weeks, now we're counting years. Which means just like you counted 49 days, 7 weeks, 49 days, here you have 7 years making a Shemitah, and then 7 Shemitot turning into a word that we haven't gotten to yet, and that's going to be Yovel. And then we have to now go back and say, hold it a second. It can't be, I'm sorry for overstating my argument, I generally try not to, but I will. It can't be that there's no relationship between these two formats and two phenomena which take place one after the other, one chapter 23, one chapter 25, and to be honest, we don't care so much about the chapter divisions in the first place, and two of these things coming right one after the other. At the end of the book of Vayikra, there must be some kind of internal relationship, which then leads us to a whole other question. That means that we would have been premature to try to understand the significance of the whole Omer when we only saw it independently. And therefore, what's the question? The question is, okay, what exactly does the Omer mean when we compare it to the Shemitah and Yovel system? Because now we realize there's something else taking place. And by the way, now we may have to actually rethink this whole idea of what Memachret HaShabbat means, or for that matter, I could actually say something else. The Torah seems to be, in a certain sense, deliberately difficult or ambiguous, if you want, by using the word or the term Mimachrat HaShabbat. It could have used a different term. It could have said after the holiday. But now, when I realize there's this comparison with Shabbat HaAretz, so that leads me to go back and now to rethink, okay, what did Mimachrat HaShabbat mean there compared to Shabbat HaAretz over here? Because again, there is something which is larger taking place. Before we read on, and we have to read on, let's just start now to think about implications. Number one, when we looked at the Sefira, and as I said, it really was in between two different things. One is Chag HaMatzot, which is a spring holiday, Chag Aviv, and the other one is Chag HaBikurim, we do know that hiding behind Chag HaBikurim is another holiday. And that holiday is Chag HaShavuot, which is actually Shavuot because of the 7 weeks. But when I say Chag HaShavuot, in terms of its more historical aspect to it, and that would be Matan Torah. Those of us who don't know or don't remember and therefore don't know, the Torah never tells us what date the Torah was given. And by the way, the holiday of Shavuot does not have a calendrical date. There's no date on the calendar that it comes out on. And just in case you think, well, it has to come out on a particular day, well, it really doesn't, because there's various phenomena which are impacted, again, by the calendar. Is there going to be one day Rosh Chodesh in Iyar? How long will be Nisan, and how long is Iyar? And therefore, and by Sivan, is it 1 day or 2 days? Which means the actual date in the calendar of Chag HaShavuot, before the calendar was set, when it was determined based upon witnesses seeing the new moon, the holiday of Shavuot could have been on the 5th, 6th, 7th of the month, and you could not predict when it would be. You could predict it's going to be 50 days after you start counting. It will be on the 50th day, but you don't know what day in the calendar the 50th day is, which again leads us to this really interesting thing. We have no date in the Torah given for the holiday of Shavuot, and we have no date for the holiday of Shavuot. We have no date for Matan Torah. We have no date for the holiday of Shavuot, which, again, I could just pause there, make the observation. You want to go a step further, it could indicate some kind of point of transcendence of the holiday of Matan Torah specifically. It could be that Torah is not limited to one time in one place. We don't know where the place is anymore. We don't know which mountain that was. We don't know the place. We don't know the day. But still, we can figure it out because it's 50 days after something else happened. So I said it's all very interesting. And again, just to stress with the 50 days, we have no evidence that Matan Torah was in fact 50 days after they left Egypt, because the counting of the 50 days is only framed in the same way that this is framed. Ki tavau ha'aretz. When you come to the land, then you're going to start counting from the time you bring the Korban Omer until the Bikurim, which means this is completely agricultural. Nonetheless, I can go backwards and say, hold it a second. It has to be the holiday of Matan Torah was more or less on the same day. Very difficult to say it would have been a different day. So I'll say it again. We get to this really interesting point of the holiday of Shavuot, which, by the way, is called Zman Matan Torah. By the way, the Magen Avram is a very famous question. He asks, how could we say in the liturgy, Yom Matan Torah, when according to the math, it could have been that day, could have been the next day, and according to the opinion of Gemara, Rabbi Yossi, which seems to be Paskin, like was most likely the next day, and therefore it seems to be that the Torah is actually given on the 51st day, and the Magen Avram says, more than that, how could we say, we're lying when we say Yom Matan Torah. It's not true, it's really the next day. And he comes out with a remarkable conclusion. He says it must be that therefore we see Yom Tov Sheni. Again, he lives in Chutz La'aretz, so Yom Tov Sheni is the real day of Matan Torah. That's what he comes up with. So first of all, I'm going to say this again, it's remarkable, but he misrepresents the liturgy. In the liturgy, we don't say Yom Matan Torah. We say Zman Matan Torah. So therefore, Zman is okay. What exactly does a Zman mean? And by the way, on top of all of this, there's another really interesting thing and that is, according to tradition, Moshe added a day. So that's the day that God wants to give us the Torah. Even according to that whole math that he does, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's the day that God wants to give Matan Torah. So Rav Kook says the day that God wants to give Matan Torah kind of creates a spiritual awakening. There's a similar idea in the Sfat Emet. There's a spiritual awakening which is presented, whereby it's on the divine perspective that the Torah, God wants to give us the Torah, and that itself is something that we need to relate to. But I'll say it again. All of this becomes quite interesting when we realize, and it all comes from this problem of this realization that we really don't know exactly. Just close the door, please. We don't know exactly what day Matan Torah was, even though we can more or less guess it. Now, having said all that already, what we still need to do is now to make some kind of a comparison between the 50th year and the 50th day, which means it would most likely be, we would be mistaken if we would completely ignore that there is the similarity in terms of the form. I'm going back, I'm repeating myself now. The form is similar. 7 times 7, 49, then the 50th. 7 times 7, the 49, then the 50th. The first one is going to be Matan Torah. Now, that is all going to be strengthened, but we're about to see. And it could even lead some of us to this realization, again, we're always scared of overstating it, that this might actually be Pshat. Not just that we have Torah Sheba'al Peh, that the Torah was given on the 50th, that this might actually be Pshat, and that's why now we need to read the next pasuk. Vavarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi'i b'asor l'chodesh b'yom kippurim ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzachem. So there are so many words in that verse that I think need to be explained, understood, applied. First one is the appearance of the shofar. But the sound of the shofar is going to ring out. By the way, not a Liberty Bell. The sound of a shofar is going to ring out. But it tells us b'chodesh hashvi'i, that's a normal problem for us. That for us, the chodesh hashvi'i is always Rosh Hashanah. That's the beginning of the year, so that's not the problem. The problem is the next two words, be'asor l'chodesh. Why did we jump over the more likely, the more obvious Rosh Hashanah, and instead move towards Yom Kippur, b'yom kippurim, taviru shofar b'chol artzachem? So the first thing that I want to point out now is we've seen a shofar before, not where you think we've seen it. Rosh Hashanah has been mentioned, but in Rosh Hashanah it doesn't say the word shofar. It says Yom Truah Yelachem or Yom Zichron Truah Yelachem. It's a Truah, it doesn't say shofar. The shofar does appear someplace, and where's that? By Matan Torah. So therefore, when is Matan Torah? That's on the 50th day. So over here, we see that in the 50th year, the shofar is being blown. That, more than anything else, then, leads us to this understanding that we do have this parallel which is taking place. And I'm going to say it again. This is the, quote-unquote, intertextuality, which is much more interesting, because what we found the shofar back in the giving of the Torah is there with the shofar in the background, and now we, on the 50th day, and now we need to blow the shofar, and now we come to this realization that the idea that Matan Torah is on the 50th day is actually, again, you can decide what the word pshat means, but now we're much more likely to understand that as the actual meaning of the text because of the shofar. But let's go back to Yom Kippur for a second. How did Yom Kippur get into this whole thing? So I want you to think about the Aseret HaDibrot for a moment. Aseret HaDibrot was said on Chag HaShavuot, right? That's when the heavens open up and God spoke. Then God tries to give us the Aseret HaDibrot, and Moshe goes up and Moshe comes down. He has the Luchot, but the people are making golden calf and he breaks them. Then Moshe goes up another time and he gets them, and he comes down. And what day does he come down with the new Aseret HaDibrot? On Yom Kippurim. And Yom Kippurim is also described in a really interesting way in the Torah as Shabbat Shabbaton. So Shabbat Shabbaton, you could say it all kinds of ways, but this is really interesting because the Shabbat Shabbaton is the 7th of the 7th, so therefore you have now actually Shavuot is Shabbat Shabbaton because it's the 50th, the 7 times 7. Yovel is a Shabbat Shabbaton because it's 7 by 7. Yom Kippur is a Shabbat Shabbaton because that's what it's called. And now you realize that when you followed, again, keep your eye on the Aseret HaDibrot, and you follow the Aseret HaDibrot all the way across, and now you realize that things are so much tighter than you realized they were before we began. And again, if I get carried away, I'll even call all of this pshat. And then we get to Pasuk Yud. Ukidashtem et shnata chamishim shana, ukratem dror ba'aretz. Dror is going to be a real interesting word we're going to have to come back to. L'kol yoshveh. So we have holiness. Kidashtem. It becomes holy. And you're going to call dror, right? Freedom, right? Will ring throughout the land. Yovel he. Okay, you want, I'll call it Jubilee, but whatever the word Yovel means. Yovel hitieh lachem, vishavtem ish elachuzato. It's going to be a time of return. V'ish el mishpachto tashuvu. So it's a time of return, and it's a time of a certain type of reconciliation. And again, I'm going to point out this idea of things returning to where they should be is actually very much a Yom Kippur theme. Yom Kippur is a time where things return back. It's also a time of Ben Adam L'Chavero, where we try to work things out. And again, it's interesting because, Chazal tell us, Rashi tells us, that when they got to Har Sinai, it was Ke'ish Echad B'Lev Echad. There was this interpersonal connection that took place. But so far we have all of these words, Kodesh, Dror, Shavtem, Isha L'Chuzato, returning back. Pasuk Yud Aleph again, Yovel Hi, Shnat HaChamishim Shnat Lachem. Right? It's Yovel, but of course, whatever the word Yovel means. And we're told here, don't plant, and so on and so forth. Lo tizru, v'lo tiktzeru, it's ficheha. V'lo tiftzeret nizirah. Why? Ki Yovel hi. Again, it comes back verse after verse, because it's Yovel. Kodesh tiyeh lachem goes back to the aspect of holiness. Next pasuk, Pishnati Yovel azot, Tashuvu isha lachuzato, which, by the way, it sounds like it told us that again. There's this time of return and things go back. It's a reset. Everything goes back to the way that it was supposed to. And when things are sold, that's what Pasuk Yudalit, Tetvav are going to tell us, when things are sold, you need to sell them in a way that you keep in mind that there will soon be this reset. And it's actually leading us to this point that we don't actually own property that we think we own. You go save up money and buy a property, and you only own it for a limited amount of time, which goes back to this point of capitalism, socialism, and so on, that we live in a world which is a capitalistic world, 49 out of 50 years. And then the 50th year, then everything needs to revert, reset, go back, and things need to go back to their core, and things need to be fixed. At Pasuk Yud Zayin, V'lo tonu ishet amito v'yoreti milokenu ki ani Hashem Elokechem. Again, don't practice any kind of abuse interpersonally. Have fear of God. I am God. Which means following these rules will allow you to live in the land. Levetach. It's going to allow you to live in the land with tranquility. And the land will give birth its fruits. God is saying, I will do my part in all this. And again, you'll be able to live in this land. I'm going to skip a little bit, but I love Pasuk Kaf Gimel. Va'aretz lo timkor litzmitut ki li haaretz. You cannot sell the land forever because God is saying it's my land. You don't really own it. By the way, the state of Israel does the same thing. Lots of places you can only buy land. You can only buy a property. You only have it for 50 years. 50 years, and then it reverts back to the government. And some places 99 years. But as I say, some places are more biblically true. But it goes back to the same thing: is you have usage, but you don't actually have real ownership. So I guess the state is God. Va'aretz ki lo timkor mitut ki li haaretz, the church. Ki gerim v'toshavim. Pay attention. Leave the church. Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. That's so interesting, because you are the strangers, and you are people that have settled, but really it's a ger toshav. You are the strangers who are living with me. So essentially God is saying, I am the true landlord, I am the true owner, and I'm letting you live there, but by all means you need to live by the rules. Kaf daled v'chol eretz achuzatchem geula. And now we have another wonderful word, and that word is redemption, titnu la'aretz. It then turns over and it expresses the social aspect of it. Ki yamuch achicha umachar me'achuzato. If somebody becomes poor and they have to sell their property, sell their inheritance, ubago aloha karov elav v'ga'al et mimkar achiv. A relative needs to come, a relative who's close to him, should come and redeem the land and bring it back. And then it starts going into this Geula phrase, because again, we had the Yovel phrase, but now it goes into this Geula phrase. V'yishki lo yagoel v'yisegado matzah kedei gulato. And again, it continues. V'shivet ha'odev le'ish asher machar lo v'shav lachuzato. Again, it goes back to this return. Ad shnat ha'yovel v'yatza b'yovel v'shav lachuzato. Again, next pasuk. V'ayta gulato atam shnat mimko yamim tiyeh geulato v'im lo yigael. You can keep going further. Geulato v'yovel. Gu'ulat olam, Yovel, right? bo ger v'tosha v'chai imach, which is really interesting. V'chiyamuch achich matayado imach, when pasuk lamed hey, when your brother becomes poor, v'chzakta bo ger v'tosha v'chai imach. So therefore, you need to treat him the same way that God is treating us. So I'm saying this whole section is really interesting, but at some point I'm going to try to start explaining. So by this point, we should realize that we have this phrase, ger v'toshav. It actually comes up a number of times. We have this concept of ge'ulah. We have this concept of how you're treating the stranger. You have this concept of Yovel. You have the concept of Shabbat. You have the concept of shofar. You have Yom Kippurim. So I'm saying there are so many moving parts over here. So we have to now try to go back and to put some of them back in order and try to make sense out of some of them. The Ramban in source number 3, which is commenting on source number 2, this is the beginning of Parshat Mishpatim, and Parshat Mishpatim again starts the whole list of interpersonal laws, and it starts off with that when you have a servant who's Jewish, Kitikna Eved Ivri, they work for 6 years and they're released on the 7th. Now, some of that was in the background of the Yovel over here as well, and here the Ramban in 3 makes this reference that by sending the slave away, let's read it. Kitikna Eved Ivri Yitchil Mishpat Rishon be'Eved Ivri Mnei Sheyesh B'Shiluach HaEved B'Shana Shvi'it Zeich L'Yitziat Mitzrayim. Just as God took us out of slavery, you need to let this person out of servitude. You can't hold someone forever. Haniskar b'dibur rishon, which goes back to Anochi. I'm God who took you out of Egypt. V'yesh ba'od zeich l'maseh b'reshit k'shabbat. Also, 6 and 1 always reminds us of working for 6 days and resting on the 7th. Ki hashana hashvi'it la'eved Shabbaton mimelechet adonav ki yom hashvi'i, creating a parallel between servitude for 6 years, released on the 7th, the same way as we work for 6 days, released on the 7th, rest on the 7th. V'yesh ba'od shvi'i b'shanim shehu hayovel ki hashvi'i nevchar b'yamim u'v'shanim u'v'shmitot, which is essentially, Ramban is telling us, no, don't miss this point. This really does run through all of these things, and therefore calling this a Shabbat, and the idea of the slavery, and the idea of the interpersonal, and the idea of the years, all of these things are interrelated, and the Ramban will continue to tell us that there are incredible secrets involved in this, and the very depth of the mystical aspect of the Torah involved in this, and that's one of the reasons they're treated with such severity. The Rambam, and this is, we're just choosing the Rambam because it's easy. The Rambam is going to deal with the question, or one of the questions we raised. It should have been Rosh Hashanah. The 50th year begins on Rosh Hashanah. Why are we waiting for Yom Kippur? So if you look in source 4, it's the Rambam, in Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. He starts, this is Perek Yud, Halacha Yud, Mitzvat Aseh L'Tkoa B'Shofar B'Asiri L'Tishrei B'Shnat HaYovel. It's a mitzvah actually for the Beit Din to do it, right? Mitzvah zu mesur lebeit din, tchila, and then the kol yach v'yach l'chai l'tkoa. Which means when it says ring throughout the land, everyone has to ring. Everyone has to blow the shofar. So it starts in the Beit Din, and then it spreads throughout the land. Everybody needs to blow the shofar. So it could be that we did not know that law necessarily, but that's one thing that the Rambam tells us. And then halacha yadalid. Me Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim lo hayu avadim niftarim lebetehem v'lo mishtabdim la'adonehem. So he says essentially that a Sereti made tshuva, that's what we normally call those days, are days which, in this sense, they're kind of like a type of a bein hashmashot. On the one hand, the people who were servants are no longer servants. You cannot ask them to do anything. On the other hand, they're not sent home yet. So essentially, he is dealing with the question, hold it, I would have thought the Jubilee year begins on Rosh Hashanah. So what's his answer? The Jubilee year indeed starts on Rosh Hashanah. Me Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim, lo yavadim niftarim lebeteim v'lo mishtabdim la'adoneim. But they're no longer forced to be slaves. V'lo asadot chazum labaleim, ela avadim ochlim v'shotim v'smechim v'atorateim b'rosheim. Rather, they eat and they drink and they have crowns on their heads, And by the way, I'm going to stress this again. This is the Rambam writing. Of course, the Rambam's taking it from the Gemara. So there's a process of freedom. The process of freedom, the first aspect is that they eat and they drink and they have their crowns on their heads. Now, what's interesting about this formulation, especially the crowns on their heads, by the way, first of all, what does it remind us of? It reminds us of Matan Torah again. The Matan Torah, everybody has, are given these crowns. That's the first thing. That's the first thing which is really interesting. The second thing is the comparison to source number 5 or 6. Marigala bipumya de Rav. Rav used to always like to say, Lo kula mazel olam baba. Olam haba ein bo lo achila v'lo shtia v'lo pira v'rivya v'lo masav v'matan. In the world to come, there's going to, if what you live for is eating or drinking, or it talks about procreation or masav v'matan, business, v'lo kina, there's going to be no jealousy, v'lo sinah, no hate, v'lo tacharut, no competition, ella tzadikim yoshvim v'atoreteim b'rosheim v'nenem yizziv hashchina. Rather, righteous people sit with the crowns on their heads enjoying the Shekhinah. So therefore, I would therefore be so tempted to say that the Yovel brings, meaning we saw, let's try to do this properly now. We have a week. The normal week is you have 6 days. The Shabbat then becomes, the crowning day of the week. But then we realize that there's actually a Omer where you have 7 weeks and then it brings you to the 50th day. But then we realize that there's a greater macro than that, and that is 7 years times 7 years leading to the 49th to the 50th year. And they say that's the macro. But now we realize there's a greater macro. And what's the greater macro? The greater macro is actually Olam Haba. Right? Which means all of the aspects I talked about, everything returning to its core, well, that's really about Olam Haba. When you think about the tzaddikim sitting and with their crowns on their heads, that's Olam Haba. So that's what becomes really interesting, the similarity in the descriptions of this Jubilee year together with the future of when you will have, there's another phrase. Let's take a look at the next source, which is an Avot Rabbi Natan, Bishvi Mahu Omer. This talks about the different Shir Shel Yom that we say on the different days. So it says, Mahu Omer, Mizmashir li Yom HaShabbat. Yom Shakulu Shabbat She'im Bo Lo Achila, meaning Mizmashir li Yom HaShabbat is Latid Lavo. So it's Shabbat. What is Shabbat Latid Lavo? She'em bo lo achila v'lo shtia v'lo masav v'matatan el tzadikim moshe v'terim b'rosheim v'nenem miziv hashchina. So, I want to just finish it. Which means becoming somewhat angel-like. So therefore, now we realize that there's at least an aspect. It's not complete because we're still alive. It's not complete because we're still human. But there seems to be this aspect of the 50th year, which therefore points towards a future redemption, points towards a future time when we get to this understanding again. In the future, there'll be no competition. So therefore, by the way, I'll go back to capitalism again. Okay, that's over. Which means, again, there's going to be certain elements which are so important to our existence right now. It's saying what Yovel does is it gets you ready for La'atid Lavo, the same way in a certain sense that Shabbat gets you ready for Yom Shekulo Torah or Yom Shekulo Shabbat or Yom that you're sitting in Nemiziv Shechina. Of course there's going to be a fundamental difference when we're still humans and we still have human needs and so on versus a time that we exist on a much more of a spiritual plane. But I'm going to say it again, all of this, we now realize when the Ramban is telling us or hinting that there's all kinds of mystical things involved in this. Of course there are, because there's a lot more depth than I think that we've been letting on to. On Pasuk Tet, where it said that you ring the shofar, right? Ring the shofar, B'chol artzachem, v'artim shofar, Torah, b'chodesh v'ii b'asur l'chodesh, v'yom ha'kippurim taviu shofar, b'chol artzachem. The Targum Yonatan adds one word. You could look at the Hebrew in source number 8. Taviu kol shofar cherut b'kol artzachem. You're going to sound the sound of freedom throughout. So again, we can go back, if you want, to leaving Egypt. You can go back to leaving Egypt and, that's freedom. And then you can now go and say, no, ein ben chorin ela mi sheyasok b'Torah. That real freedom is actually somebody who's involved in Torah. So therefore the blowing of the shofar, is the whole thing of Torah. But there is this former there is this other level of all of this, which takes us now to the 50 on this macro level, which is the Yovel, and then the shofar goes out, and it's a time of freedom again, but it's a freedom on a different level. And I'm sorry that I keep on taking it, at least on one point, to the economic expression of all of this, is that, there's, my wife is an expert when it comes to the Bedouin, so she says that there's a Bedouin saying that you don't own land, land owns you. And there's a certain aspect of any kind of ownership, it becomes a responsibility. And over here, there's a freedom from the land in a sense. You don't have to get up in the morning and work. By the way, the other side of this, you're also not going to have food at the end of the year. No, but everything now has become free. You become liberated from those kinds of responsibilities. So I'm going to say again, there's something else which is taking place. Listen to the way that Rav Hirsch expresses this in source number 9. B'yom Kippurim tavriu shofar, Yom Kippurim shel kol shana hu Yom HaTchiyah HaMusarit. That Yom Kippur is an awakening of morality. Ufishmnat HaYovel hu gam HaTchiyah HaChevratit shel ha'umah, which means it is again, the term social justice is one of these overused terms today. But he's saying is that that's when social justice is actually played out in terms of this, everything returns back to its rightful owner and so on, and taking care of the have-nots, and the have-nots need to go back and revert to become haves again. B'yom zeh yotzei hakol mipi Hashem, which is really interesting because now the shofar, and everything I'm saying now, that rabbis are going to have to use some of this when they talk about the meaning of the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. He's saying right now is that when we blow the shofar, it's actually the voice of God. It's God is declaring it, but what's this ineffable sound which comes out? It's the sound of the shofar. Shnat HaYovel to be kapara chevratit. It's going to be social atonement for social sins. And again, it really all goes back to the economic as well. The sound of the shofar releases slaves. Now again, I'm going to say it again, that that a rabbi before the blowing of the shofar is going to reference this and say is that blowing of the shofar in Yom Kippur releases slaves. When we listen to the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, we need to become released from the things which enslave us as well. Which means and this is what I meant before of the intertextuality, that therefore when you have it, again, the shofar, not just the blowing, is expressed over here, and we know that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Tru'ah, but a Tru'ah of what? Of the shofar. So now you have to say, so what does one teach on the other? So therefore, that blowing of the shofar, and by the way, the Tkiyah Gedola that we do at the very end of Yom Kippur is really connected to this, but maybe there's another element to it. We'll see how much time we have if we're able to get back to it. We'll skip a little bit here in Rav Hirsch. Uke'en ze matzanu gam b'tchiyat hamusarit shebekol shana. Rosh Hashanah solelat haderech el kaparat ha'asur. That on a yearly basis, Rosh Hashanah leads the way to Yom Kippur. So therefore, this whole concept of Aseret Yemei Tshuva, which happens on a yearly level, is also going to be there in the 50th year, where the 10th day where the Rosh Hashanah prepares for the 10th day. Which is really what we saw the Rambam citing from that same Gemara. But again, he understands that, there really is this social aspect. So now, I want to point, I think we'll have time to go in 2, maybe 3 directions in order to try to, again, make this all a little bit richer, because there were just so many elements over here. One is in Yoshua Perek Vav, and this is one of the things I'll give you for homework, and that is, notice over here the blowing of the shofar. Notice the 7 times 7. Mm-hmm. Notice that this is going to bring about the entering into the land, which will then give each one of the Shvatim their inheritance. So therefore, it's interesting that the starting point of entering into the land is going to be with the same kind of elements, which will then also be the revert back to its default settings, which will take place on the 50th year. So I'm just saying is that when you read over here, Shiva Kohanim Yisu, Shiva Shofarot, Yovalim, which is even better, because the shofar over here is called Yovel as well, and it says B'yom HaShvi'i, then it can be Sheva Pa'amim, and you're going to surround the city, Sheva Pa'amim. So the Sheva, right, the 7 times 7 elements are all over here in Yoshua. So now I don't have to work out all the details for you. I've already given you enough, but as I said, you can go and do your homework and then decide exactly how you think all of this is connected. Source number 11 takes us all the way back to the first time Omer is mentioned. And the first time the Omer is mentioned is when the mun is mentioned. The amount of mun which fell was an Omer. Omer legulgelet. How much do you take is an Omer. So it's interesting that we count the Omer afterwards, but again, the Omer is an amount. And over here also, what does the Omer come to teach us? It comes to teach us about Shabbat, because it falls for 6 days, and on the 7th day it doesn't fall. But notice on Pasuk Kaf Gimel, Yom Aleim Hu Asher Diber Hashem Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh LaHashem. So also you have over here, even though the trup is a little different, a Shabbat Shabbaton, we have a Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh LaHashem, Machar. What you also have over here is that essentially all food comes from heaven. All food comes from God. There is no barter, there's no sale, there's no stores, everything. Again, it's this kind of situation that gets us ready for something else. And I'm just leaving it that I think that you can't leave this whole analysis without leaving the Omer there and the Shabbat over there, but this is probably the core which is necessary. The Ramban in source number 12 is going to do, once again, what the Ramban does so well, and that is he's going to intrigue us. He's going to tell us a little bit. He's not going to tell us too much. The Ramban essentially has an attitude of telling us like little hints of mystical things, and then says, I can't say any more, I'll have to shoot you. And he writes as follows, in source number 12. He's commenting on the word dror. Now for us, the word dror means freedom. The al derech ha'emet, derech ha'emet for the Ramban is always a Kabbalistic idea. Milashon dor holech v'dor ba. So he says the word dror indicates intergenerational. Okay, that is, again, if you want to go a little further, that's perhaps an aspect of freedom that you don't realize. Okay, look, can we think for a second what this could mean? V'chein Yovel sheyoshuv el Yovel asher sham sharashav, to go back to the core. Vihi tiyeh lachem. So let's just think a little bit. One is that I'm returning back to my land which belongs to my ancestors. I'm returning back to the roots. It's this, sometimes there could be a historical mistake, right? What's a huge historical mistake? Jews living outside the land of Israel is a historical mistake. Okay, again, we were forced out of it, but it's not that it's natural. So over here, he's saying that this idea of dror, what does it mean? Dror is correcting intergenerational mistakes which are taking place and trying to make things better, trying to make things right. The Rabbeinu Bechaye, now I actually cut out pages and pages of sources right here between 12 and 13, or between 13 and 14, and because there's lots of people who are students or students of the Ramban who then will try to explain this. One is Rabbeinu Bechaye. Whenever you get to an interesting Ramban or a difficult Ramban, or especially a Ramban which is Kabbalistic, so you can go to the Rekanati. Rekanati is going to be a little bit harder because he's going to be pure Kabbalistic ideas. Or you can look at the Rabbeinu Bechaye, you can look at Yitzchak Famako, there's some other places to look, who all dealt with the mystical parts of the Ramban, Levush, but the Rabbeinu Bechaye also explains things on a simpler level, but he also has different paragraphs generally in his commentaries. Over here he gets the Kabbalah, the Aldach, source 13, the Aldat Kabbalah, Yovel hi milashon, the Al Yovel yishlach shorashav. Again, that's what the Ramban was referring to before. V'yirmos ki kol hadorot yuvlu el hasiba harishona. Again, going back to the core, l'chein nikra Yovel b'shem dror, ki hua Yovel asher sham shorashav hadorot v'hanivraim kulan. So you'll note that he does a little bit more. By the way, right afterwards, he gets into one of these mystical teachings that the Ramban was hinting at back in Mishpatim, because it's connected to the 7 times 7 and so on, but I'm not going there today. Instead, I want to go to one more place, and that is the book where all of this is right beneath the surface, and that is the book of Ruth. And that's your other homework, because of course we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, which is not an accident either. But I'm not sure how much you noticed that the book of Ruth really has elements of Yovel staring at us in terms of the Goel, in terms of the Sadeh, in terms of things returning back. But it's not just that, because part of what, if we're going to look in Perek Bet, right? I have Perek Bet, Gimel Dalet over here. In Perek Bet, we have this conversation taking place that Naomi says, right? Naomi lekalata, Baruch hu laHashem, asher lo azav chasto, et hachayim ve'et hametim. By the way, realize that's part of Dror. Part of the idea of Dror is connecting the people who are living back with the people who are no longer alive, because that's exactly what this concept of Dror is. It's correcting historical mistakes. And by the way, if I'll talk about historical mistake in terms of Chutz La'aretz, that's exactly what happens to the family of Nomi and Ruth. Is Avimelech goes off with his kids, they go off Machlon Kilyon, they go off into Chutz La'aretz, and they end up running into difficulties. The whole part of the story is, but they come back to the land. But I hope you realize how important that is, especially when I'm saying that we need to have a Yovel perspective on the book of Ruth. But that's the starting point, is that there is this chesed that is taking place. And then it says, continues, Vatomer lanomi karov lanu ha'ish, which by the way is exactly the theme that we kept seeing in this chapter, is that we have responsibility for your brother. You have a responsibility when they lose their money. You have a responsibility to help people return back to their core. Why? It says, Ha'ish migo alenuhu, because he is the one who's going to bring about our ge'ula. So that, therefore, again, was that word which came up again and again in this chapter. In source number, in Perek Gimel over here in Ruth, it continues. She climbs into his bed. I'll leave that, some of you. I can't say this unless you take your heart medication first. So we'll but that as well is, I don't know if you know this, but because you haven't been in these classes, if I ever say anything amusing, it gets cut out of the recording. It doesn't get there. Yeah, that's right. Over here they have the unedited version. V'hi b'chatzi layla v'yichred haish v'yelefet v'hine isha shochevet miraglotav. Which goes back to this point that you are the goel and take responsibility. Pasuk Yud Bet v'ata ki amnam ki goel anochi v'gam yesh gor karov mimeni lini alay l'v'yababoki im yigalech tov yigael v'im lo yachpotz l'gech l'galticha. Again, you realize that word goal is like 5 times in one verse. It's because that really is this theme. It's really this theme of the geula. And then in Perek Daled, we come to the realization that there is this dual aspect, which means this other fellow, our Ploni Almoni, he's actually willing to take the land. He's willing to take the land back and bring it back into the family. But then Elimelech articulates this other level of responsibility, and that is this responsibility of, let's just take a look at the way that he phrased it at Pasuk Hey. Vayom Boaz b'yom k'notcha sadeh miyad Naomi u'me'et Ruth hamovia eshet hamet kanita lahakim shem hamet al nachalato. That's Dror. That's exactly what the Ramban was pointing at, is that we need to bring this person back alive. We need this to once again become the land of this particular family. A historical mistake took place, and now we need to correct that mistake. But that correction is not just on the land, it's also on the people. It's also on the family, and therefore it's not just the land, it's also going to be en route. And at that point he backs down. He's willing to take the land, but he's not willing to really do what is the historical responsibility. I'll just then point out, V'gamet Ruth movia eshet machlon kaniti li isha lahakim shem hamet al nachalato. This is all pasuk Yud. V'lo yikaret shem hamet me'im echav u'mishar mekomo. Again, correct the historical mistake. That was pasuk Yud. Pasuk Yud Bet should remind you of all of this, because there was another time that this happened, and that was the whole story of Yehuda turning to his sons, Er va'Onan and Pasuk Yud Bet. Who was the child that resulted from all that? Perhaps inadvertently, but again, that was Tamar leaning. Again, Tamar and Ruth become really interesting strangers who enter in, who cause there to be this correction of a mistake. V'hi betcha ki beit peretz asher yolda Tamar liYehuda, which means, again, here we have that example of correcting the historical mistake, but this is actually much sharper, and that's the conclusion of the book, whereby it's already hinted at in Pasuk Yud Zayin, but we'll V'atikrena lo hashchenot shem, right? V'atikrena shmo Oved, hu avi Yishai avi David, ve'ela toldot Peretz, which means fixing historical mistakes are in the family of Yehuda. It goes from Peretz. Peretz will lead at Chatzon, Chatzon will lead at Ram will lead at Aminadav, Aminadav will lead at Nachshon will lead at Salma, Salma will lead at Boaz will lead at Oved will lead at Yishai, Yishai will lead at David. And if you didn't pay attention, this is talking about Geula, which means if the whole background over here is the Geula, and this is going to be the beginning of the Geula, which means Malchut Beit David, and then eventually Ben David, which means this whole book of Ruth is talking about Geula and becomes really like this linchpin, right? Connecting the past and the future, connecting a past which made a historical mistake, made a wrong turn, got lost, was almost completely forgotten, land was lost, name was lost, nobody's left, but historical mistakes are able to be fixed. And essentially that's what Yovel is really about. It's fixing these historical mistakes. But again, I think we would be mistaken to read Yovel by itself and just see it, as a snapshot by itself, without realizing that it's connected on the one hand back to the Omer, going between Pesach and Shavuot, and all those elements which connected us to Matan Torah, and on the other hand, leading us towards the future and taking us towards the actual Geula. And the hint of all of this was, of course, those freed slaves who now are going to sit there with the crowns on their heads, which on the one hand should remind you of Matan Torah with the crowns which we received, and on the other hand, remind us of those descriptions, the Gemara, of the future in the Messianic age. People are going to be with crowns on their heads, or not the Messianic age, even Olam Haba, as it were, with the ultimate time when we get past, all the transient existence that we have right now. Which means Yovel, therefore, I think is much more interesting because it becomes, again, a metaphor for the past and a metaphor for the future, and it becomes this linkage, and all of this emerged out of that little phrase that the Ramban gave us and told us, now dror is this interconnection between different generations. Because now you realize that's, of course, what the book over here of Ruth is about, which means it's fixing that past and it's fixing that dead part of the family which we thought we had lost, but then look at that beautiful, really dramatic and really emotional, actually, end of the book of Ruth, which then just takes us straight to David HaMelech and then fix it, it picks up, there will be a Malchut Beit David. But why is there Malchut Beit David? I mean, Yehuda's kids made a mistake. Avimelech makes a mistake. The idea of dror is we can fix mistakes. So as much as Yovel fixed mistakes on a level which perhaps you would say is economic and social and so on, yeah, all that is true. But when it comes to actually the Jewish vision of the world, taking us to a place where the entire world fixes all the historical mistakes, and we get to this point of this intergenerational responsibility, whereby we fix all the things from the past, and then we create a time of true social justice and true divine justice, which comes on into the world, and that, of course, has to begin with Malchut Beit David and then end with Ben David.